So there is January Littlejohn. And some of you may recognize the name because January was at the forefront of the early fight against or in favor of parental rights and against school districts that would substitute their ideology for the wisdom of parents. And she joins me on the program from the organization Do No Harm to talk about some very disturbing changes that have been made pushing gender ideology on the most vulnerable kids. It's good to have you on the program.
Thank you so much for having me, Kay.
If I may, how did you get into this? You were a mom, substitute teacher. How did someone who's paying attention have their daughter victimized by this system?
Well, that's a great question. As you stated, I was a substitute teacher, and in fact, I was volunteer of the year at the middle school where this happened. And at the time that this happened to my daughter in 2020, not many parents were speaking up. In fact, there was only one lawsuit at that time that had taken place, but it was on the policy alone. It wasn't actually on harm that had occurred to a family like what happened to us. And so these kind of policies had snuck into the schools by activist organizations under the guise of non-discrimination and anti-bullying policy. And what they were was anti-parent because they encouraged schools to keep a psychiatric issue from parents. And it's unacceptable. It created a huge wedge between us and our daughter and really thrust us on this path of no return, and our lives have been changed forever as a result.
So you took it to the Florida State Legislature. You assisted in the passage of important legislation protecting parents because, we think it happened even in Florida. In Wisconsin, the DPI in Wisconsin is controlled by a bunch of progressives. So, we kind of look to states like Florida and say, geez, even there, it's happening. Now, I know that you guys have done some important and good work to help protect parents and kids. So your daughter was 12 when they decided to target her?
She was 13 at the time.
Okay.
And thankfully, she is on the other side of the confusion. She is 17 now, entering her senior year of high school. And that is what I do for Do No Harm now. I help parents understand what is happening with their children, understand what gender ideology is, the lies that accompany it, and I help them find the resources they need to parent their own child through this confusion.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, that is what's going on with these children. They are being exposed to an ideology that is purposefully confusing them and placing them on a path of medical interventions that they will become a medical patient for life.
So your daughter fell victim to this, and you're a mom who's paying attention. So now what we've learned, January, is that they are explicitly targeting very vulnerable kids. So it's not just the kids who are maybe a little shy or the kids who, just hit puberty and they're kind of confused. Now they're targeting kids on the autism spectrum, specifically targeting kids on the autism spectrum who are even more prone to the influences of authority figures, who are even more potentially socially awkward or isolated or have difficulty interacting. Tell me about this. This is, as we think we're winning the fight and you see things like this, you're thinking, no, we're actually losing it because they don't seem to care.
Well, that's exactly right. And we knew about this connection because Hannah Barnes and others had written about this connection from their experience at the Tavistock Clinic. And what your audience has to understand is the U.S. is now an outlier in how we are treating sex confusion in children and adolescents because the rest of the Western world is following the CAS review. They're following the best evidence that we have. And then you have this Autistic Self Advocacy Network, who is supposed to be an organization protecting their members who are on the spectrum. Yet they have created this horrific guide that is filled with pseudoscience nonsense. It's purposefully confusing an already vulnerable population, as you stated. And this guide provides tons of misinformation that does not give an accurate portrayal of these invasive, irreversible interventions, including serious medical complications from puberty blockers, hormones, and surgeries that are being performed on children and adolescents here in the U.S.
The thing is, there's a huge number of an enormously large population. I think I read in the document that it was 40% of kids on the spectrum will experience some kind of gender confusion. And if you're going to target those kids for transition, you are hijacking their ability to come through it like your daughter did. You're a mental health counselor as well. I should have mentioned that. So we're talking about people like you who would be given guidance in how to address the concerns of parents with children on the spectrum. And the guidance would say, tell your daughter that your daughter's a boy. And then if your daughter 6 months later decides your daughter's both, affirm. I can't even fathom that. The people you would trust to help your kid are the counselors.
And that's exactly right. Not only has my field been infiltrated by this insidious ideology, but so is the medical field. And if you look through this guide, they talk about puberty being a choice. Puberty is not a disease that needs to be avoided. It is a natural and crucial part of becoming an adult. It's not just about secondary sex characteristics. There are growth in the brain and bone development that are necessary. And this guide presents puberty as a choice. They have normalized a psychiatric issue and are falsely teaching children, as you stated, that you can choose to be a girl, boy, neither, or both. And they are being sold that these invasive interventions are evidence-based, but of course they are not. Sex is binary. That is real, and we need to get away from this pseudoscience nonsense, because at the end of the day, vulnerable children and even young adults are being harmed by the lies of gender ideology.
What do you do if you're a parent and the mental health professionals that you would reach out to are not going to help your kid, are instead going to continue the confusion, particularly if your kid is on the autism spectrum? When 98% of young people, by the time they're 25, get over this. They go through, confusion because they're young, because they're going through puberty, and then they get over it like your daughter did. So if you're a parent, what do you do?
And that's exactly what they need, Vicki. They need the gift of time. They need healthy boundaries set by parents. So as they're exploring and maturing, they aren't able to make these kind of irreversible decisions for themselves, because it's all based on self-ID. And obviously, this varies drastically now, state to state. And so if you're in a state like California, Washington, Oregon, your parental rights are non-existent when it comes to this issue. And in terms of finding a therapist, it's very challenging, because as a parent who experienced this in 2020, there were very few resources and information out there. Today, that is not the case, thankfully. And if you go to our website at donoharmmedicine.org, we have a wonderful parent resource page that parents can go to. They can reach out to me through our website, and I can help them connect with support groups that are going to give them accurate information, evidence-based care, so that they can truly help their child come on the other side of this confusion.
Yeah, you're talking about California, some of these places. Most of the states aren't quite as extreme as California, but there aren't. I mean, you have to find a lawyer and sue in the state of Wisconsin. You'll have to contact a lawyer and sue. So if the therapy community is obliging WPATH, this organization that even its own people admit is basing its recommendations on ideology. I mean, it's an uphill fight. Every single school district that have these policies in place, and now they're hiding behind this illegal change to Title IX to justify all of it. So, I mean, it's not just California. It's not just the kooky states. Maybe we can pretend we don't care because it's California. But it isn't. It's all across the United States, even as Western Europe is moving as fast as it can away from this radical ideology that's killing kids.
That's exactly right. And what's happening in schools with the social transition, like what happened to our daughter, that is not a neutral act. This is a psychosocial medical intervention that schools are grossly unqualified to be doing. And it creates a huge wedge between the parent-child relationship, and they really have no business diagnosing or doing any kind of medical or mental health intervention without parent permission.
Can I ask you where your daughter got the idea? Was this something that she saw on social media, that she thought, I kind of identify with that? How did this ever get into her head?
So what parents have to understand is this ideology, there's no hiding from it. Because even if you homeschool or you're in a private Christian school, this ideology has infiltrated every aspect of our culture. For my daughter back in 2020, it was an in-person friend group. And even though we didn't allow her to have access to social media because she was 13, her friends did. So they were consuming the gender ideology TikTok on non-binary identities. They were watching the trans influencers on YouTube and then sharing that information with my child. And even though my daughter's not on the spectrum, she does have some of those markers because she's ADHD and she's gifted. And so just like kids on the spectrum, she would perseverate or hyperfixate on subjects for very long periods of time. So when she was exposed to this ideology that has all of these gender identities and flags and colors being directly marketed to children, she became hyperfixated on these identities, on these flags, and she became sort of an expert on all things trans.
Wow.
And that's
her
where my
peers.
daughter was. That's correct. It was an in-person friend group. There were about 3 of them that had started identifying as some form of transgender at that time. And you have to understand today, transgender no longer just means identifying as the opposite sex. There's about 72 gender identities for them to choose from. There's non-binary, gender fluid, and the list goes on and on.
So your daughter, who at 13, and I remember what it was like to be 13, I'm not that old, your peers meant everything to you. Everything to you. So if your girlfriends were doing something, good chance you were going to try to do it too. So,
well, especially for a child like my daughter and these kids on the autism spectrum, where they do have difficulty making and maintaining friendships. This was the first friendship that she ever actually felt like she belonged in. And so initially we were thrilled. We thought she found a quirky group that was similar to her, similar interests, things of that nature. But then we started to become very alarmed. And at the end of the day, what people have to understand is most of these children falling prey to this ideology have low self-esteem. They have co-occurring mental health issues. As you mentioned, up to 40% are on the autism spectrum. And what the school did was they affirmed my daughter's self-hate.
yes.
They made her think that the only way to love herself was to try to become something she could never become. And it is unforgivable what the schools are doing.
It's mean
and
cruel.
Social transition plans are widespread. You can look them up. They all come from a place called Gender Spectrum. All of these transition plans look exactly the same, and it's all under the guise of keeping children safe. But if they really cared about safety, parents would be included every single time.
I like how you said that, January. It affirmed her self-hatred. I appreciate the time on the program. DoNoHarmMedicine.org. DoNoHarmMedicine.org. That is a resource that parents can use, grandparents can use to find help, especially in a crazy area like Dane County, Madison, Wisconsin, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where, it's just blue madness here. Thank you so much for joining me on the program today. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Wonderful to have you. January Littlejohn, again, that website is DoNoHarmMedicine.org, and we will be right back.